here's again something which the previous Rebbe doesn't write about, as far as I know, at all. But the ganze Welt redt wegen dem. Yudel Chitrik writes it in his Sefer, the Shimas Dvorim, and I'm imagining if he writes it, he Mistama heard it in Lubavitch. In other words, this Messiah has a psashtik l'shaychas to Lubavitch also, but he brings from different Svarim. Yudel Chitrik claims, again, he supposedly has stories, but the Baal Shem Tov tried to go to Eretz Yisroel 3 times. On 3 occasions, the Baal Shem Tov tried to go to Eretz Yisroel. And again, the rumor is, like I told you last week, that the Baal Shem Tov's desire to go to Eretz Yisroel was to meet the Eretz HaKodsh, and that presumably if the Baal Shem Tov would meet the Eretz HaKodsh, Mashiach would come. In all Hasidic circles, you hear this. In all Hasidic circles, you hear this. And in Lubavitch, you also hear it. But Lubavitch is getting it. The Frierdiker Rebbe, as far as I know, makes 0 mention. I've never seen this. Not this and not this. Not the Parsha of the Eretz HaKodsh, but not the Parsha of the Baal Shem Tov wanting to go to Eretz Yisroel. 2 of the stories I know. The 3rd story, he's mitzayin to a Sefer, and I never looked up the Sefer. So I'll share with you this Parsha, Baal Shem Tov going to Eretz Yisroel, and supposedly Baal Shem Tov come to Eretz Yisroel. Bottom line is Baal Shem Tov never got there. The first story was when he was a Nister. It could be I told you the story already. That Baal Shem Tov learned with Achia Shileni for 10 years. And during those 10 years, the Baal Shem Tov was more or less not in this world. I told you, he used to leave the house on Sunday, come home to Shabbos, and his wife used to pack him food, and he came home, the food wasn't touched. Not because he was fasting, because he forgot to eat. A Yid should not eat for 6 days, not drink for 6 days. It wasn't the pshat that he was fasting, he forgot to eat, the Baal Shem Tov. During the years that he was learning with Achia Shileni, he would leave the house on Sunday and come home for Shabbos. We talked about that, Barichas. So the story was, and again, where was the Baal Shem Tov when he was learning with the Achia Shileni? He certainly started out in Brod, where his in-laws, his shver lived, and then he left. Upon him, it looks like he also spent some of that time in Tlust, which is the city where he was born. And he was outside of the town, on the hills, on the mountains. And the way he tells the story, there was a cave. He says he never saw this cave before, but when he met Achia Shileni, there was suddenly a cave. They used to go into the cave and they used to learn together. So the story was that there was a group of pirates, bandits, who had a hideout not far from where the Baal Shem Tov Hasa Gidreit. And they see a lone man walking on the mountains. And of course, in those days, the best way to do a crime and get away with it was to destroy the evidence. When you stole something from somebody, you had to kill them. Because if you didn't kill them, sooner or later the police came after you. If you killed them, there was no way for them to identify you because there was no forensics. They didn't have fingerprints and other methods. So in those days, they used to say, dead men tell no tales. This was the belief amongst criminals. Finish the crime and you get away with it. You do it halfway, you'll be punished. So they decided to kill the Baal Shem Tov and to take his wealth. Baal Shem Tov had nothing in his pocket anyway. But then they noticed something about this man, this lonely man, that he was walking on the mountain, and there was a cliff, there was a chasm, there was a split in the mountain. And they saw him walking towards the edge, and they could tell that he did not realize that he was about to walk off a cliff. And the mountain opposite his came towards him, and he kept walking, and the Baal Shem Tov was not even aware that a miracle occurred, that the mountains came apart. So then these guys decided maybe they shouldn't start up with this rabbi, maybe we should leave him alone. And they befriended him. And they asked the Baal Shem Tov for a bracha fatzlocha in their business. Everyone has got to make a living, Everybody has to make a living. The panos. So the Baal Shem Tov promised them a bracha on the condition that they would never hurt a Yid, which they agreed. And the Baal Shem Tov had told them that he has a desire to go to Eretz Yisroel. So it happened once that this group of Rishoyim disappeared for a Meshach Zman Rav. They disappeared. And they came back after a few months and they told the Baal Shem Tov they found a land route, a way to go to Eretz Yisroel without having to go on a boat. In other words, not having to go into the Mediterranean. You could walk around. The lands, Asia and Europe are connected. And the Baal Shem Tov went with them. So the Baal Shem Tov and a bunch of rotzchim, a bunch of murderers walking through the wilderness. They walked for a long time, for a few weeks. And then they came to a canal. There was a deep, opening in the earth, full of water. And there was no bridge, obviously. The only way to walk across was they took a tree, they lowered it to the bottom of this canal, and they catapulted across. They threw themselves across. And one by one they're jumping across until it comes to Baal Shem Tov's turn. And the Baal Shem Tov sees, as he approaches this ma'avad, this crossing, that this is the entrance to Gan Eden. It says a Chumash that there is Gan Eden ba'aretz, right? Originally Gan Eden was on this planet, and that the Eibishter put a la'at acherev ha'misapechas, a revolving sword. And the Baal Shem Tov saw, even though it was a wilderness, this was in fact the entrance to Gan Eden. In other words, if the Baal Shem Tov would cross, he would be killed. So he walks with these Ganovim for all these weeks, and then he tells them, I changed my mind and gone back. And they were, of course, very disappointed, but there was nothing to talk about. So they went back. So the bandits are angry, he wasted their time. And the Baal Shem Tov was wondering, what's the Hashgacha Pratis? How could the Eibishter affect that he should waste literally 5-6 weeks of his life walking for nothing? On the way back, they came to a lake, to a fresh body of water. And near the lake, there was a frog. And the frog was very large. It was not normal. It was a freak. And the Baal Shem Tov saw that in this frog is a neshama, Gilgul. And the Baal Shem Tov spoke to this neshama. And the neshama said to the Baal Shem Tov, I was a tzaddik who lived, I think he said 1,000 years ago, a long time before. And I was once mizalzel in the Tilas Yadayim. Tilas Yadayim is from Shlomo HaMelech, yeah? I was once mizalzel in Tilas Yadayim. It's neshama mitzvah rabban esachak. And because of this, I was given an oynish, a punishment. The punishment was that I was given tests that I could not withstand, and I fell and I became a Rosh Hagoma. This was all part of the punishment for being mezalzel once in the Tilas Yadayim. And my neshama is not being allowed into heaven. In other words, I can't even be judged. And I'm mizgalgal always in animals connected to water, because my Aveda was with water. And he was out in the wilderness, there was no people, so there was no tikkun. So the Baal Shem Tov took some water from this lake, he made a bracha shakal, he drank it, and the frog died. So Baal Shem Tov understood that the Hashgacha Al was that he should travel this incredible distance to be Maila one Neshama. This is a story, I think that's it. The second story, which is I think more famous, and I don't remember it as well, is that Baal Shem Tov spent Pesach in Istanbul. Istanbul is in Turkey. Istanbul is the capital of Turkey. Once upon a time they called it Constantine, Constantinople. That was the Christian name of Istanbul. The Muslim name is Istanbul. And the story was Baal Shem Tov decided to go to Yisroel with his daughter, Odel. And I believe that at this point he was no longer a Nist, he was already a Rebbe. And they had what they needed for Pesach. They took with them food and other things. And en route, I forget the details, whether the ship capsized or they were captured by bandits. The bottom line is they ended up in Istanbul, Erev Pesach, with nothing. Gunished. Not clothing, not food, gunished. They lost everything. So the Baal Shem Tov went to the Beis Medrash to daven, and his daughter Adel went down to the river or to the ocean to wash the clothing that they had. And she stood there over those clothing and cried. She was crying. She was crying that, I don't think she was crying because she was hungry. She was crying that her father, the great Tzaddik, the Heilig Baal Shem Tov, is going to be in such a Ma'amad Amat. Adel was an unbelievably great woman. The Baal Shem Tov's daughter Adel was a special Indian. We have to talk about her also. She was crying. As she's crying, somebody walks by. It happens to be the Reisha Kohol, and he sees a girl crying, a young woman crying. So, and she obviously was a foreigner, he didn't recognize her, so he approaches her and says, who are you? Why are you crying? So she tells him, you should know my father's a very, very big tzaddik, and we were on our way to Eretz Yisroel, and for whatever reason, we were not able to make it, and en route we lost everything. We lost our wine, we lost our matzahs, lost everything. I'm crying that my father, the tzaddik, is going to have such a disturbed Pesach. So he says to the Baal Shem Tov's daughter, problem solved, you can't be by me. I have plenty of matzahs, it's kosher, it's my medicine. Come on, Sfardim and Ashkenazim, they figured it out somehow, yeah? And the Baal Shem Tov spent Pesach by this Reisha Kohol. And he believed her when she said to him that Baal Shem Tov was a big tzaddik. So the story was, Baal Shem Tov took a nap out of Pesach, and he didn't wake up. Yom Tov Tzadikim often lay down Friday, Yom Tov, and he slept late. And he got up late, and I think the story was that they waited for him. And Baal Shem Tov was like a shtel daven in Ma'ariv. And he davened Ma'ariv with unbelievable dveikus. And if I'm not sure it was in Hallel of Ma'ariv, but if it was not in the Hallel of Ma'ariv, it was in the Hallel of the Seder after Ma'ariv, that in one of the psukim of Hallel Gadol, Right, he was red. He wasn't an ordinary sleep, yeah? I think when he said the pasuk, one of the psukim in Halal God, he said, now there was a whole thing that happened that night. That night there was some Masida in the palace. They wanted to run on Tzaras Yidden. And this Reish HaKol has a dream that his father came to him because other members of the king's council had advised him against the Jews. And the story, of course, had been that his father had once saved the king. The king had been captured, and he was sending these carpets, supposedly as material for the robbers to use for profit. But he was sending messages, subliminal messages in these carpets. And the father of this Reish HaKol, who had also been the Reish HaKol, realized that there was something unusual about the carpets, and he bought many of them, until he was able to piece together that the king was writing these messages and where he was. They went and they found him, they captured the bandits, and the king had given him a note, which gave him free access to the palace anytime he wished. And this note had been passed to his son. And when he had this dream and his father came to him, he went in the middle of the night to the mother of the king, the wife of the former king, who had known about this note and the story behind it, and he was able to use this connection to be mevatel gzeira. And he comes in late to shul the next day, like b'chaskes atayda, and he runs into shul and he says, "Mazel tov, the Eibishter made a big nest." The whole community did know from the ganze Maise that there was some kind of a gzeira, and the Baal Shem Tov Pashat was in Istanbul at that time, and he saw Baruch Koche that something was not beseded, and he Pashat Payil Yeshuas that the gzeira was in his battle, and it was all in the schus of the tefillah of the Heilige Baal Shem. Spent that Pesach in Istanbul, and he left a mark over there. This is another story. The third Maaseh Day, and I don't know it, but apparently the Baal Shem tried to go to Eretz 3 times. Azay Detzelt, or the Emes or the Nicht Emes. Another thing, the Baal Shem Tov was constantly traveling. The Baal Shem Tov's Nesiyas, the Baal Shem Tov's travels, had many purposes. He traveled to help Yidden. He traveled to inspire Yidden. He traveled with Samar Frenyon and Pnimim, all kinds of travels, but he was constantly traveling. And of course, as a rule, the time for the Baal Shem Tov to take a trip was Motzei Shabbos. The Baal Shem Tov had a goy. His name was Alexi. He was Baal Shem Tov's Balagola, and he had a great job, this Alexi guy. Why? Because Baal Shem Tov's wagon never fell off the road, you understand? It didn't matter if it was raining or not. The Baal Shem Tov used to call him right after Havdalah and tell Alexi Mefarin he had to right away hitch up the horses to the wagon, and they would travel. Sometimes the Baal Shem Tov traveled alone, sometimes he traveled with 3 Talmidim, and sometimes he took with him a whole minyan. And there's a ribuy sipur, there's many famous stories about the Baal Shem Tov and his travels. Now during these travels, the Baal Shem Tov used to meet all kinds of people. He would meet very ordinary people with whom the Baal Shem Tov had a language. He'd meet even lowly people like Ganovim, and them too the Baal Shem Tov had a language with. In fact, I'm going to tell you a story which pains me, and frankly, it's hard for me to imagine the story, but I heard this from a non-Lubavitcher Hasidic Yid. So I'm telling you the story, even though it's hard for me to imagine that the Baal Shem Tov should meet a Yid that he wasn't able to help. But this is the story, that there was a Yid, a big Rasha, who met the Heilige Baal Shem Tov, and he gave the Baal Shem Tov a walking stick as a gift. And one day, the Baal Shem Tov was sitting in his cheder, and the musician Magid Achim was with him. And suddenly the Baal Shem Tov picks up the stick, and he hands it to the Magid and says, "Give it to him." The Magid didn't see anybody, and he became a little bit distraught. He couldn't understand what the Baal Shem Tov wants, so he took the stick. He's holding it, there's no door. Then he put it out as if giving it to nobody, and then someone took the stick and disappeared. And he was filled with gewaltige pachad. And the Baal Shem Tov told him that this was a Yid, a Greisa Rasha, a big Rasha, who had given him this gift. And now that he died, he came to the Baal Shem Tov and asked the Baal Shem Tov that he should be misaking him and schlep him out of his tzaddis. And the Baal Shem Tov said, "I couldn't help him, so I gave him back his stick." Frankly, the idea that the Baal Shem Tov couldn't help a Yid is beyond my comprehension. But this is a story, and like I told you many times, especially stories from non-Chabad stories, you got to take them, for sources, you got to take them with a grain of salt. The Baal Shem Tov could speak to the biggest go'onim and speak their language, to the most simple people. Everybody, the Baal Shem Tov had a way to his heart. This was the greatness and the uniqueness of the Baal Shem Tov. There's a famous sipur, which is brought be'emes in Mamor Makzarim and Maltner Rebbe. The Baal Shem Tov met a big goan, and he said to him, "For any kasha, I can give a teretz, and for any teretz, I can give you a kasha." And he went through a series of examples. He said, "Avart," Baal Shem Tov slugged him up, And after this person was convinced that the Upshlag was correct, the Baal Shem Tov reversed it on him and explained it. And this Yid found himself defending the Baal Shem Tov Upshlag to his Dvar Teira. And then after the Baal Shem Tov had convinced him it was correct, he slugged it up again and so forth. And the Baal Shem Tov, of course, later explained to him that Teira exists on every level, in every world. And what is a teretz in a lower world becomes a kasha in a higher world. And since there is an infinite number of worlds, there are infinite number of levels of limud Teira. The Baal Shem Tov could speak to Yidden on this madrege. And Derech Agav, talking about the Baal Shem Tov's lomdus, there's a story that the Alter Rebbe, the Rabbi Yaakov brings it in the Sefer Sipurim Neiroyim, and this Sefer is considered reliable stories, because the Rabbi Yaakov was a Bar Samche. In fact, when the Rebbe got married, our Rebbe got married, the Friedrich Rebbe gave him to read during the week of Sheva Brachas the Sefer Sipurim Neiroyim. And there's a story that the Alter Rebbe once overheard two Yidden, Misnagdim, talking. There was a room full of people. Alter Rebbe was on the other end of the room, and they couldn't imagine that Alter Rebbe could possibly hear what they were saying. But the Alter Rebbe had incredibly good hearing, and he heard one say to the other, "He's taka gon," meaning the Alter Rebbe is a gon. And his Rebbe was also a very big gon. But the Rebbe of his Rebbe, meaning the Baal Shem Tov, was an Am Haaretz. Alter Rebbe heard this, and he came across the room and he approached them. And he told them, you simply do not have the facts right. And in fact, the Baal Shem Tov was a gon Eilam. He says, I'll repeat to you a pilpul that I heard from the Heilige Magid, B'shmoi shel Baal Shem Tov, and you'll see what kind of a gon the Baal Shem Tov was. And Alter Rebbe proceeded to say a pilpul for many hours, several hours, with very edel svaras. And when he finished, these two young lights said to the Alter Rebbe, these svaras are so ruchni, so edel, it sounds like the svaras of Abaye and Rava. So the Alter Rebbe said, these are all the derech of Abaye. And Rava has a different derech. And he brought out that the Heilige Baal Shem Tov, we have such little teira from him, and we don't seem to see the lomdes. The Baal Shem Tov was not known as a gon. In fact, he was a gon elam. And he had a language with big deilim, big goinim. At the same time, he had a language with Anashim Pshutim. We got another story about the Baal Shem Tov and goinim is a mice with the Parish that we all know, that he came to a market and he heard, and of course the Baal Shem Tov loved going to the market. He used to ask the Anashim Pshutim how they were, and they would say Baruch Hashem, and he gave the Rebbe the Baal Shem Tov great tainug when people used to bench the Eibishter. And on this particular occasion, he heard that not far from the market there was a Parish. A Parish means a hermit, an ascetic. We know about Prushim from the previous set of memoirs, the Parish of the Brovne. These people used to sit with blinders on their eyes, with cotton in their ears, and with cotton up their nose. They shouldn't see, hear, and smell. And they would sit and learn Teira, Balpeh, Yemam Valayla. I mean, the Maisa say, to be a Parish, even if you're an actor, you have to, these people knew Kol Teira Kol by heart. They push it sat and learn Teira by heart. Precious. And there was a Seder Avodah like this. Precious had a place. But not all Prushim were equal, you understand? Some Prushim were talking completely moved from this world. Other Prushim were imitating. To be a Parish like that is not a Pashta Geschäft. And the Baal Shem Tov always had an ayin bechenes. He was able to discern whether a Parish was taka a Parish or he was trying to be a Parish. In other words, whether he was in fact removed from all taivas of this world or he was just doing the part. The Baal Shem Tov met this Yid and he told him Shalom Aleichem. This Yid knew who the Baal Shem Tov was, and then the Baal Shem Tov asked him, "Was machst du? How you doing?" So he told the Baal Shem Tov, "I don't have time for formalities, for greetings. Let's talk Teira." So the Baal Shem Tov said, "But I want to know how you do it." So he told the Baal Shem Tov again, "You want to know how I'm doing? In the market, there's a lot of Pashat Yidden. They have plenty of time. I don't have time for salutations, for greetings." So the Baal Shem Tov said to this man, "Was nimmst du zu bei dem Eibishter sein Panos, dein Panos? Why are you depriving the Eibishter of his Panos?" So he says to the Baal Shem Tov, "What does that mean? How I'm doing with the Eibishter's Panos?" And the Baal Shem Tov told, this is a famous teres of Baal Shem Tov, the Rebbe brings it many of the Maimorim, Va'ata Kodesh Yeshet Tilos Yisroel. The Pasuk says, Va'ata Kodesh, the Eibishter is Kodesh. Kodesh means removed. That means he has no connection to this world. Yoshev, what Kayachal causes that the Eibishter should have a relationship with this world? When Tilos Yisroel, when a Jew praises the Eibishter, when a Yid says Baruch Hashem, Geleib dem Eibishter, Nadaink dem Beri Elam, when you thank the Eibishter, you make a place for the Eibishter to sit. Baal Shem Tov was trying to impress on this person, the Takazayna Parush, but at the same time, you also have to bring the Eibishter into this world. There's a sefer called Sipurim Neiroyim, with a long Arichas HaSipur about one of the Baal Shem Tov's journeys. How he called one of his Talmidim, whose family lived in Lvov, Lvov is Lemberg, which is far away from Baal Shem Tov lives. And the Baal Shem Tov asked him, do you want to go to Lvov? So he says to the Baal Shem Tov, I haven't seen my family in a long time. I would love to go to Lvov. So the Baal Shem Tov says, okay, come with me to Lvov, but you're probably not going to see your family. It's a long arichas. En route, they stopped in a shack, and they came into a house, and they met a Yid who was a menuga, a Yid who was full of illness and sickness. And the Baal Shem Tov and this Yid embraced each other, and they were so happy to see each other. There was a moedik akira of alavovis between these two people. And he asked the Baal Shem Tov to stay for Shabbos. And the Baal Shem Tov says he couldn't, he had to go. And it's about Gebeten, he pleaded and begged. Baal Shem Tov left. And the Baal Shem Tov told this man that this is Mashiach Shabador, and that he was going to pass away that Shabbos. That Yid was going to pass away that Shabbos. And that the Baal Shem Tov did not want to have a tzishter to Shabbos, but mainly didn't want to spend Shabbos with him, and this is why they traveled on. He says, in a very short time, the Baal Shem Tov used to have Kfitza Saderech. You know? Pachas Vayetze, you have Kfitza Saderech and Chumash, what Kfitza Saderech. There's different Taifanim, how Kfitza Saderech occur. Baal Shem Tov traveled very quickly from great distances. They found themselves in Lvov, and they went to stay on what was called the Students' Street. It was a university, a student street. The student street, a Jew was not allowed to live. And if a Jew would come on that street, they literally would tear him to pieces. They would kill him on the spot. And the Baal Shem Tov drove down this student street, and the students saw a Jew, and they gathered, and the Baal Shem Tov drove up to the house of the tailor. There was one Jew who lived on that street. He was a Jewish tailor. He used to make the uniforms for the university, for the school, so he had an exemption. And the Baal Shem Tov spent Shabbos there. And this tailor said to the Baal Shem Tov, you're taking a great risk. Baal Shem Tov spent Shabbos there. And the Baal Shem Tov brought with him a minion. And as soon as Shabbos started, a galach, a koimer showed up. The head galach of this here place showed up. And he stood and he watched the Baal Shem Tov. He didn't say a word. He stood and watched the whole time. Tfilas Minchet, Tfilas Maidiv. Shachas he came back again. He stood the whole time watching the Baal Shem Tov. Mincha he came back again. Right after Shabbos, Baal Shem Tov left. This man traveled hundreds of miles, didn't see his parents. Went straight back to Mezhber. Years later, this Yid was an Edis, that Galach had become a Ger Tzedek. Years and years later, this man met a Yid, a big Choshev Yid, who was a Ger Tzedek, and he revealed to him that he was that Galach, that bishop. And the Baal Shem Tov spent Shabbos over there, and whatever the Cheshbonus were, the bottom line is he became a Ger Tzedek. Like I said to you before, there's hundreds of stories, many of them true, about the Baal Shem Tov's travels. And like I said to you before, the traveling to the Baal Shem Tov has minim shayim. There's all types of reasons and bases for the Baal Shem Tov's travels. One of the more familiar stories, this is in Falakan Sefer, is the story with the Baal Tshuva. That the Baal Shem Tov, before he passed away, gathered his Talmidim around himself. And he told each one of them what they should do with the rest of their lives. There's a sipur with the Mendel Haradoker, who was there b'shas the Baal Shem Tov's Stalkus. And they told of Yankov Yosef that apparently before the Baal Shem Tov passed away, his Talmidim gathered around and he told a story. And in this story, he outlined the future of each one of them for the duration of their lives, for the rest of their lives. And when they used to meet, Talmidei Baal Shem Tov used to ask each other, where are you holding in the story? This told them where they're holding in their lives. One of the Talmidim Baal Shem Tov was by the name of Rabbi Yankiv. And Rabbi Yankiv had the schus that whenever the Baal Shem Tov traveled, he would travel with the Baal Shem Tov. Baal Shem Tov took him on all of his trips. So before the Baal Shem Tov passed away, the Baal Shem Tov told this Rabbi Yankiv that what he wants for him to do is to travel around telling stories about the Heilig of Baal Shem Tov. He says, and you can have from this parnasa, people will give you something. And you're to continue telling stories until you will have a siman, a remez, a raya that you completed your shlichus. Anyway, this Rabbi Yankiv traveled, and he told stories of the Baal Shem Tov, but he didn't get rich. How much money can you make telling stories? Apart piaster, it was a very difficult life. The Heilig of Baal Shem Tov until he heard that in Romania, which was very far away, there was a Yid Agvir who paid substantial sums of money to anybody who would tell him an original. A story of the Baal Shem Tov that he didn't hear, he would pay Hain Te'efes. So he thought to himself, this is his opportunity, this is his windfall, how a little bread. So he traveled to Romania, he came to this Yid's house, and the Yid was very wealthy, a big house, and he had special rooms for orchim, guests, and he had a guard special room for B'nai Teireh, for Talmidei Chachamim, that he would place them there. When Rabbi Yankiv came, this Yid was Makabel Ponov with the greatest simcha, And he put him into his special guest room and he gave him kol hakavod. And he told him that he has done this many times before, that he invites Yidden to come to be by him, to hear stories. So he's going to invite the whole town after the Friday night meal. People are going to come and he tells stories. Okay. Comes Friday night, they have Seder Shabbos. At the end of the meal, people gather. And he turns, Rabbi Yankiv, the host turns to Rabbi Yankiv, and he says to him, Nu, you tell a Maisa. So Rabbi Yankiv opens up his mouth, and nothing comes out. He comes up with a blank. Every story you ever do, Baal Shem Tov disappears. And he starts to stammer and to stutter, and he's very embarrassed. He looks like a ganef. He looks mamish, nitzvah alav kaganef. And he says to the host, I hope you believe me that I'm in fact Talmud of Baal Shem Tov. I don't know what happened, but I'm coming up with a total blank. And the host was very understanding. He says, you're tired? Tomorrow. Don't worry. This Rabbi Yaakov doesn't sleep that night. He's pushed ois mensch. You can't understand what happened. Comes Shabbos, lunch, the second meal of Shabbos, Yom de Shabbata, and again he invites people, and again he turns to Rabbi Yaakov and says, Nu de tzela ma'isa, and he goes blank. And he's very apologetic. And again the host is very understanding. He says, okay, shalosh shudas, raiva de raiva. And the shalosh shudas, again he invites people, and again people come, and again he turns to Rabbi Yaakov and says, Nu tell us story of Baal Shem Tov, and he comes up with a blank. And he's so ashamed of himself. He feels like he's perceived as a user. He came, he stayed in his best room, he ate his best food, he's a lowlife. He felt terrible. So he tells his host, I don't know what happened to me, but I am leaving after Shabbos. I can't, the busha that I'm experiencing from appearing mamish like a chvilnisht. And the host says, nah, stay a few days. He had no issues. He says, don't worry, I believe you, don't worry. He says, no, I cannot leave, cannot stay. Anyway, after Shabbos, he immediately gets a wagon, fun. As he climbs into the wagon, he remembers a story. He says, I remember one story. So the host says, get people quick. So he tells them the following stories. It was a Matzah Shabbos, the Baal Shem Tov called the Balagola Alexi. He says, we went through fields and wildernesses. We had no idea how far we even traveled. Early Sunday morning, we arrived in a town, small town. The whole town was one street with a few stores. And opposite the stores was a big amphitheater, an outdoor stadium kind of arrangement with seats, staggered higher and higher and higher. And we noticed that all of the homes were boarded up, like as if something was happening. We drove up to one house, the horses stopped. And the Baal Shem Tov said to me, he says, Rabbi Yankiv, knock on the door. I knock on the door, still. I knocked and I knocked and I knocked. Finally, one board opens up. One window is deboarded and a head sticks out of the head. And a Jewish face says to us, get out of here. There's going to be today a pogrom. Run for your lives. Don't stay. There's going to be today a pogrom. He says, I'm here with Rabbi Yisroel Baal Shem Tov and he wants to come into your house. So he tries to reason with him. They're going to be killing Jews today. This is not the place you want to be today. He says, Rabbi Yisroel Baal Shem Tov is here and he wants to come inside. Once he realized that the Baal Shem Tov was a bigger action than him, so he quickly stables the horses and brings them into the house. He boards up the windows and he turns to the Baal Shem Tov and says, you don't understand what's going on here. There's a famous koimer, a famous galach, who travels from place to place, and he's a very good preacher. And he has unbelievable sinas Yisrael, hatred, venom for Yidden. And wherever he goes, he rallies up the goyim, he rouses the goyim with hate for Klal Yisrael. And usually after such a speech, there's a pogrom. So we don't know what to do. We boarded up our homes, and we're laying low, and we're praying for the best. Baal Shem Tov doesn't say a word. Around 9, 10 in the morning, the goyim start to gather in the amphitheater. And at 10 o'clock, whatever time it was, the galach comes with his whole regalia, with the Geshmin of the brother, and he's going up to make his speech. He starts talking. The Baal Shem Tov goes over to the window and opens it. Takes away the board, opens the window. The host is ois mensch. He says, Rebbe, this is suicide. And the Baal Shem Tov is looking. And people, a lot of people, they came in their finest, their Sunday finest, and the galach is watching him. And after a meshach zman, he turns to me, says Rabbi Yankiv. He says, go across the street, go over to the galach and tell him, Yisroel Baal Shem Tov is here and he wants to speak to you. So I walked out, and the host again is ois mensch, and I walked across the street. I went straight through all the goyim. Nobody touched me. I walked up to the Baal Shem Tov and I said to the goy, to the galach, I said to him, Yisroel Baal Shem Tov is here across the street and he wants to talk to you. So he stopped and he said to me, tell him I'll come when I'm finished. So I went back across the street and I went into the house, and the host already saw a nest that they didn't tear him to pieces on his first trip in and out. A nest. And I told Baal Shem Tov, he said, no, tell him he has to come down. So I went back across the street, I walked through all of the crowd and nobody touched me. I went up to this man and I said to him, Yisroel, Baal Shem Tov is here and he wants to speak to you now. So he stopped and he followed me. We walked through the whole crowd, we went into the house. The Baal Shem Tov and this Galach went into a room and they spent hours alone. The crowd waited and waited and waited and waited and dispersed. Ois pogrom. There was no energy, After many hours, Baal Shem Tov came out with this man and left. We have no idea what they discussed, but we heard crying. And when the Yid came out of the room, it was obvious that this person had gone through some kind of a metamorphosis, had gone through an emotional turmoil. This is a story that Rabbi Yankov tells. Rabbi Yankov finishes telling the story, and the host stands up. And he says to Rabbi Yankov, I want to tell you the rest of this story. He says, I was a Jewish boy, and I was a Yosem. I was an orphan. And I was a Shevet, I was a troublemaker. What do they do with people who made trouble in the olden days? They would put them in a cage, they put them in a cage, and put them next to the shul, and everybody who would walk by would spit at them. So my experience with Yidden was so rotten, so miserable. I was an orphan, so I was a wild child. How did they treat me? They humiliated me. So I ran away, I went to a convent, and I became a Christian, and I swore to myself that I'm going to dedicate my life to hurting Jews. He says, and I am that Galach, he says. I am that Galach that was notorious for spreading venom and for causing pogroms. This was me. And the Baal Shem Tov came, and he was Me'edim Ami Tshuva, and he brought me back to Yiddishkeit. And I felt terrible. I mean, he was responsible for the death, mamish, of many Jews, the loss of property of many, many more. And now he realizes how terrible it was. So I said to the Baal Shem Tov, is it possible that the Eibusher should ever be able to forgive me? And the Baal Shem Tov says, yes. And so I said to the Baal Shem Tov, is there a way I would be able to know that the Eibusher was makabel my tshuva? And the Baal Shem Tov told him, when somebody will come and tell you your story, you will know that the Eibusher has forgiven you. And he says to Rabbi Yankov, when you came to my house, I recognized you. He said, you think you didn't sleep last night? He tells him. When you didn't remember the story, you thought you remember the story because you went to tumult, yeah? I knew why you didn't remember the story. He said, the tshuva I did last night, and the tshuva I did this morning, and the tshuva I did, he said, Simon, he said, now the Eibusher had forgiven him for his chet, and Rabbi Yankov was paid handsomely, and he was able to stop traveling. And like I said, there's kama v'kama maises. We'll continue Mitzvah Hashem next time. With Hashem's help.